Good evening, and thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA-Federation of New York for our monthly Folio series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of the New York Jewish Week. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome British historical researcher, journalist, and author Rosie Whitehouse, who will be in conversation with Andrew Silo Carroll, editor-at-large at the New York Jewish Week. Before I begin, here are some words from our partner, UJA. Tonight's book selection is an historic reflection of a time where anti-Semitism ravaged the Jews of Europe. Sadly, our world today is once again facing an unrelenting rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Our partner, UJA-Federation of New York, knows that standing up to anti-Semitism and supporting Holocaust survivors has never been more important or necessary. UJA is fighting against hate and enhancing Jewish life, especially on college campuses and across New York. They're funding community security initiatives, ensuring a quality of life for Holocaust survivors in their last days, and enriching Jewish opportunities and Jewish pride. And as Israel continues to navigate the long-term effects post-October 7th, thanks to our amazing community, UJA is investing more than $167 million so far to address every imaginable need across Israel. One day soon, the hope is that things will improve. For now, it's important we all need to remain loud and proud of our Jewish life. With that, we turn to Rosie and Andrew to dive into this poignant story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thea. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to introduce a book by someone who I very much admire. It's a terrific book. It's a poignant book, as Thea said, and it's a disturbing book in many ways. It's about there's no surprise here, it's about the Nazi invasion of France in 1940. It's about a family caught up in it. And it's about a journalist's search for the truth about what happened when many of the survivors were loath or at least reluctant to talk about it. And putting this all together is our guest tonight, who I'll introduce now. It's Rosie Whitehouse, who is a journalist specializing in Jewish life after the Holocaust. She writes for BBC Online, The Observer, The Independent, Tablet, The Jewish Chronicle, Haaretz, and many others. Rosie is a graduate of the London School of Economics. She's a historical advisor at the Vienna-based Centropa, a Jewish History Initiative Institute. Her first book, The People on the Beach, Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust, was published in 2020, and she joins us now from London. Rosie, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually.
Well, hello, good evening from London.
So your book is first and foremost a family story, and in your case, quite literally a family story. So can you tell me how the family connections you have to the protagonist in this, I should remind people, nonfiction real life story, Huguette and Marion, and how you came to the story right there in your own house in London?
Well, Granny Marion, I have to call her Granny Marion. She was my husband's mother, so she was my mother-in-law. And the two sisters are Granny Marion and her sister Huguette. Huguette is still alive and she lives in San Francisco. But Granny Marion passed away in 2010. The two sisters were and are completely different, and to such an extreme that one of them, that Huguette, was always willing to talk about what had happened to her. She was always willing to talk about her Holocaust experiences. But my mother-in-law, it wasn't that she didn't talk about it, she was just careful about what she said. And she was very reluctant to give away any details. And I always knew that I should never push her, because any sane daughter-in-law knows that you never ask your mother-in-law questions she doesn't want to answer. We always knew, I always knew the bare bones of the story of what happened. Indeed, on my husband and I's first date back in 1984, he told me that his grandmother had been murdered in Auschwitz. The conversation didn't really linger on it very long, largely because we had so much else to talk about, and our lives became very exciting and pressurized. My husband's a foreign correspondent. We moved very quickly afterwards to Eastern Europe, where we lived in Romania, and then we lived in Yugoslavia during the fall of Yugoslavia. My husband has covered practically every major conflict since then. So there've been many other things that have occupied my mind rather than what happened to his grandmother, which may sound very odd because his grandmother, Edith, was indeed murdered in Auschwitz. And this story is not only the story of the two sisters, but it is also her story.
Right. And just to clarify, Edith is the grandmother, Huguette and Marion are the next generation.
Absolutely,
And
yes.
that's Tim, your husband's aunt and mother.
That's right. That's correct. And what really prompted me to start to look into this story was in 2019, we went to visit Huguette in San Francisco. My husband began to ask her questions about what had happened during the war. We always knew that there was a story that after her mother had been deported to Auschwitz, that Marion and Huguette went to the ski resort of Val d'Isère, which is today extremely famous. And I always wondered what they were doing skiing in the middle of the Holocaust. It sounded rather odd to me at the time. And during this skiing holiday, Huguette fell and broke her leg. And the local doctor was called. He was called Dr. Frédéric Petry. And he said to Granny Marion that Huguette's break was so bad in her leg, she had to be taken down into the valley to the hospital in Bourg-Saint-Maurice. At this point, my mother-in-law, who was always an extremely calm person, punched Dr. Petry in the face. And Dr. Petry quickly realized that these were two young ladies in extreme desperation, and he realized that they were Jewish. And he said to Granny Marion that she should go away and leave Huguette with him, and that he would care for her for 6 months until her leg was mended, which is duly what happened. Now, when we went to San Francisco in 2019, we decided that we would try to get to the bottom of this story somewhat. And I work with Holocaust survivors all the time here in the UK. And I had begun to realize that our family knew the bare bones of what happened in the Holocaust, just like many of the people that I work with here in the UK, but we did not know the full details. And as my husband asked Huguette these questions about what had happened to her, I suddenly realized with complete shock that nobody in the family had ever tried to say thank you to Dr. Petry, and nobody had ever tried to find his family to say thank you. So Huguette had returned in the 1970s to Val d'Isère to try to find him, but he had died. And that was the end of it until 2019, when I began to talk to Huguette about what we should do about this. And she suggested that we should have him recognized as righteous among nations by the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem. And I began a process of trying to put forward the dossier to have him recognized as righteous among nations, and that is how the book began to emerge.
So let's back up a bit and just talk about the family. Who was Edith? Who was her husband? And where were they where were they in life, and where were they physically when the Nazis came into Paris?
Right. Well, the subtitle to my book is Betrayal, Love, and Resistance in Wartime France. And betrayal is a key thing here because the family were originally from Berlin. So they were twice betrayed. They were betrayed by the German state, for which the two sisters' father, Johannes, had actually lost his foot during the First World War. He had been in the Battle of the Somme. And both of their parents were brought up in Berlin, where they had a large factory, and they were extremely wealthy. They guided their factory through the economic collapse of the early 1920s and were part of the effort to make Germany prosperous again during the Weimar years. But in 1933, the sisters' father, Johannes, saw the writing on the wall and decided that the family had to leave. He did he did not speak English. His Edith, his wife, said that they should go to America as his brother had done, but he decided they would go to France because before the First World War, he had been a student in France and he spoke fluent French. So the family, in the summer of 1933, moved to Paris. And one of Huguette's earliest memories is stepping down from the train at the Gare de Lyon.
And so they're somewhat prosperous. He was a movie producer of sorts. I think you used the term.
He reinvented himself. He had originally been working for the family factory, which belonged to his wife's mother. And then when they moved to Paris, he totally reinvented himself. He changed his name. He called himself Jean-Paul, and he became a movie producer. And he was a very successful movie producer in France during the 1930s. But of course, he was then betrayed again by the French state because he was naturalized as a French citizen in 1938. And that must have been one of the pinnacles that he must have felt that he and the family were safe. But of course, he was then betrayed because those naturalizations which had been granted were reviewed by the Vichy government. And in fact, the family were denaturalized in 1943. The denaturalization actually took place while his wife, Edith, was in the Drancy transit camp.
So what struck me, because I think, as much as I read this history, you always forget that how the fate of the Jews in France kept shifting. First, the Nazis come into Paris. I think the women went to Vichy-controlled Free France. Is that correct? And then there's then they have one status, and then their status is going to keep changing as with the whims of the government and just whatever borders they cross.
Absolutely. Well, they fled from Paris in 1940 in the Great Exodus from the city, with thousands and thousands of people who clogged the roads going south. The two sisters' father decided that he would settle in Cannes. And this is where another level of betrayal begins to happen, because his wife Edith wanted to cross the border and go into Spain, but he decided not to do this, and he went to Cannes. And in Cannes, he rented a house for her and Huguette. Granny Marion was elsewhere at this point, and he rented himself a flat for himself and his mistress. So this is another level of betrayal, which is in the book, which is a purely family story of betrayal. And in October 1940, when the weather went off on the Riviera, he decided to return to Paris with his mistress and left his wife Edith and his daughter Huguette alone in Cannes. Now, Huguette always says that if the parents had stayed together, they would both have been caught and taken to Auschwitz. Granny Marion had a slightly different take on things and said it was all her father's fault. So be you who read the book to be the judge on this.
Right, and then there's from there, and I'm probably going to get the chronology wrong, but they're going to move to Nice, I believe, because Nice is then under control of the Italians, which makes them somewhat safer, if not completely safe.
Yes, basically, when in November 1942, when the Allies took control of North Africa, the Germans moved in and occupied Vichy France. And in retaliation, the Italians moved in and occupied the Alpes-Maritimes. And Edith decided that she would move with Huguette to Nice. She thought it was safer. It was a good gamble at the time. And they remained in a certain sense of security within Nice during this period. It's always known, the Italian occupation of Alpes-Maritimes is always looked at through the prism of what happened to the Jews, and the Jews lived in relative safety. Now, the Italians didn't do this particularly because they loved Jews. They did it because they wanted to differentiate everything they were doing as different from the Germans, because they wanted to take Alpes-Maritimes and integrate it into the Italian state. It had previously been part of territories attached to the House of Savoy. We don't need to go into that now. But the when Italy capitulated in September 1943, the Germans were swift and they moved in. And basically, so many Jews had crammed themselves into Nice in the fact that it was a safe place. There were 25,000 Jews sitting there just waiting to be picked up. And Edith went to get false papers for herself and Huguette, and she was caught in a trap. Huguette had never really understood why this trap was created, but in the researching this book, I was able to find out exactly what happened.
Yeah, you tell a really interesting story about just there are the forgeries, and there was an industry of forgeries, and clearly there was a informer who kind of ratted out the whole operation. And then Edith ends up in Drancy, which is a stepping stone to Auschwitz. I want to talk a little bit about two things I found interesting about Drancy: the conditions under which they were there. And I know you went back there in recent years to see what's happening there now. How is it being remembered by France, and who's living in what had been a transit camp, essentially, for Jews about to be deported?
Yeah, Two Sisters is not just a book about the past and a book about the past family history. It's very much a book about the present. When you read the book, you'll see that I travel around France and I try to assess the situation today. So one of the things is that I went to Drancy. I actually went with my eldest daughter, whose middle name is Edith. She's named after Edith. And Drancy is a very shocking place. Those of you who may have been to the Yad Vashem Memorial will have seen the name of Drancy written in the memorial on the floor. It's all very grand, but when you actually go to Drancy, it's a really tumble-down housing estate in a really dismal part of suburbs outside Paris, which were built to house workers in the factories. It was always way apart from the really fancy boulevards of the 8th arrondissement. And today it's a miserable place where people who are literally one step off of the street live. It's also a very radicalized place where many Muslims live. And this is very much an important relevance, is where you can see how the Jews were ostracized from French society. You can see these issues also at the moment with Islamophobia in France.
And I know they built a memorial there, but I think you described it as quite ugly. And but it's remembered and it's not remembered just because of its location is outside of the city center.
It's outside of the city centre. Very few people ever go. Since I originally went when I was writing Two Sisters, they have created a memorial at Bobigny Station, from which 25,000 people were deported, including Edith. It's a strange mixture where there's a garden around the original station, which still exists, which is a mixture of plants from the Mediterranean and plants from Eastern Europe. To me, it was one of those ideas that probably sounded quite a good idea when it was put down on the local council meeting, when they decided how would they try to commemorate this. But quite frankly, I really wish that the flora and fauna of Nice had never had to meet the flora and fauna of Silesia, where Auschwitz was located. So it's a kind of strange idea. Memorials can be like this. They can be very odd.
So remind me, when the girls are separated from their mother, they're how old?
Marion was born in 1920, so she was already 23, and Huguette was 15.
And what do we know of Edith's deportation to Auschwitz? Is that well documented? Do you know when she was sent and when she died?
Yes, we know that she left. She died on the 31st of October. She was gassed, which is interestingly also the day that Granny Marion died. So a strange twist in history. But yes, the documentations of the deportations from France, the paperwork is all still exists. So you can see the whole list of the people who were transported on each convoy. And what really shocked me was that when I was shown the list at the Musée de la Shoah, that I realized that because there were 1,000 people on the convoy and they kept these people together from the moment they were put in the square at Drancy and transported on buses to Bobigny station, and then they queued up in front of the wagon, that I could actually identify the 50 people who traveled with Edith to Auschwitz. And I included a list of their names in the back of the book, largely because I felt that it was it was rather rich of me to tell Edith's story when there were a story of 49 other people here who also went on this transport. And hopefully, at least by giving them a name and putting their photograph next to them on the list at the back of the book, that we can show that it's purely by luck why we remember one victim of the Holocaust and not another.
Mhm. Remember something upsetting, you include a photograph of that manifest itself with the 50 names. And this is a weird detail, but it's beautifully typed. The Germans were so careful, or the French who were collaborating with the Germans were so careful to write down names and addresses and numbers and to collect their supplies, all part of this great kind of illusion of
Yes,
humanity.
but also shockingly, also on the train was a freight wagon which was full of produce, which was going from France to Auschwitz, which included wine and sugar and chocolate, and it's listed that it also included 1,000 Jews. And if any of this stuff doesn't arrive, then Berlin has to be told immediately. So it's really like how you see how they regarded the Jews. They put them, alongside a bunch of grapes. Really, it's kind of bizarre.
So now the girls are alone, but they're not alone. Their father is living. He's in Paris with the mistress. At this point, is this when they make their way to Val d'Isere?
They make their way to Val d'Isere, and what this is part of the crux of the story is I always wondered whatever my mother-in-law was doing taking a skiing holiday in the winter of 1943. Well, the answer is that actually I discovered that Granny Marion was working for the Jewish resistance, and from 1940 to 1943, she'd been living in Lyon, where she had fallen in love with a Jewish member of the main French resistance, who in the winter of 1942-3 had walked out over the Pyrenees out of France and come to London to join General de Gaulle's army here in London. He was then later parachuted back into France, but he left Granny Marion alone at the most dangerous point during the war, and she turned to the Jewish resistance for help, because one of the ideas that we have about false papers is that you just get a little piece of paper and you write somebody's name on it like this and you go, oh, bingo, here's my false paper. It wasn't like that at all, that you had to have a false paper that was registered at a town hall. And that the police knew that this was registered at the town hall. So if you were arrested by the Vichy police or by the Nazis, that they would ring up the town hall and they would go, do you have a blah, 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 blah there? And the police would then look down the list and say, yes, of course, that person's registered and lives in our village. But in fact, these people had multiple documents which were then copied and then used to be given to Jews. And of course, every month you had to collect ration coupons. So every month, my mother-in-law would have to go up to Val d'Isere to collect the ration coupons and take them back to Lyon to give them to the people who were using the false papers of the people who lived in the area. So it was really extraordinary to put these pieces together and to see what she was doing. And
So I think it'd be important at this point maybe to get a sense of who these people were by looking at a picture of them. So Beryl, you could show the photo with the family along the wall, because that shows it shows the mother, the two daughters, and a couple of their friends. So while Beryl's getting that ready, we can continue to talk. And actually, we should
before we look at these pictures, I think there's something very important that I need to say, is that my mother-in-law always claimed that she had no pictures of her family.
Right.
And after she died in 2010, we were emptying out her flat, and my husband found a box of photographs. Now, they're a big box of photographs, A4 size. And he opened the lid and he was like, oh my, this is pictures of from the war. And he put them in his bag, and they came back to our house, and they ended up in the back of his wardrobe. They'd been in the back of his mother's wardrobe. It was only in 2010, during the lockdown, when I was writing Two Sisters, that I said to him, where are those pictures? And he went upstairs and he took them out of his wardrobe, and it was a brilliantly sunny day in July 2020. And he laid them out on the bed. Now, they're large pictures like this. They're not little snaps. And he put them out one after the other on the bed. And for us, it was completely shocking to see them, because although we had a picture of Granny Marion with her mother, we had never really looked at these pictures before. So now if you show the picture, then I can talk a little bit about it.
And you'll tell us when and where this was taken to.
This was taken in Théols-sur-Mer, which is near Cannes, on a day out. Now, in the middle there, in the slacks, smiling away, is Edith, the mother of Marion and Huguette. Huguette is on the, well, right-hand side of the screen. She's the younger girl. Granny Marion's actually looking down at this point, and between her and Huguette is a girl who was a friend of hers who was actually killed in a car crash after the war. The other people have no idea who they are. But what really intrigues me about this picture is there's someone who isn't in the picture. And Edith is looking right at this person, smiling. So it's a mystery. Who was she smiling at? But these pictures were taken literally weeks before she was deported to her death in Auschwitz.
So there's a certain, so this is what part of France that they at least have the safety to be having what seems like a bit of a beach holiday.
Yeah, this is during the Italian occupation of the summer.
Right.
Must have been July. It looks like July to me. It's very bright sunshine. And also what you can see from this picture, which is interesting, is what the girls are wearing, because they can only wear these clothes because they're in the Italian occupation zone. You could not wear short skirts and sandals like this in Vichy, France.
Wow. Okay, so you took us to Val d'Isere. Marion is in the Jewish resistance. You write about a Jewish resistance, which I don't think a lot of people are even aware of. I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but the CCMA,
Yeah.
the 60 or the 60. Tell us a little bit about that and how
Well,
it's.
actually, yes, you're quite right to say that most people are not aware of it, because if any of you have ever been into the Musée de la Shoah in Paris, when you walk in, there's a model of the Warsaw Uprising on the left-hand corner, and there's in most museums related to Holocaust issues in France, there is absolutely no mention of the enormous Jewish resistance that happened in France. There's firstly it grew out of the fact that there was a sort of what you might well know as the Judenrat, a Jewish council, which was set up by the Nazis, and its sixth department was the youth department. The sixth department, the CZM, went underground, and these produced a huge network of résistants who were producing the false papers, who were hiding children, who were taking children out of France, who were bringing money in from Switzerland. And that's also one of Granny Marion's great stories, that once we went on a boat trip with the kids in Lake Annecy, which is up in the Alps, and we came back from the holiday showing off about how we'd been on Lake Annecy, and Granny Marion goes, yes, I was once on the lake with a suitcase of money that fell in the water. Again, we know not, but she was clearly moving money around, which was money which was being brought from the JDC in New York to Switzerland. But it wasn't just this act of resistance of saving children and producing false papers. The Jewish resistance in France also created the Army Juif, and the Army Juif took up arms against the Nazis. And they fought all the way with the Free French forces into Germany. And after the war, they arranged much of the passage of illegal passage of Jewish refugees, particularly from the British sector. And many of those people sailed on very famous ships like the Exodus. And this is also where it becomes part of the interesting story of the two sisters, because I mentioned previously that Granny Marion's lover and first husband had gone to Paris to join the Free French, and he was parachuted back into France in the spring of 1944. He was parachuted into the Toulouse region. He was Jewish from Paris, and he was parachuted in with a Protestant, and their job was to unite the Protestant and the Jewish Maquis who were living and working in the mountainous areas in the Toulouse region. And this is a story which has never been told, and I was very lucky to stumble across it, because I came across an archive which was kept in a wardrobe in a tiny little village in the Toulouse region, and many of the documents which were in that archive are actually classified. But they just happened to be sitting in a wardrobe in the south of France.
So when she's in Val d'Isere, Marion is a courier, I guess we could call her.
Yes, courier.
And probably it sounds much, that makes it sound much more, undangerous than I'm sure it was. I mean, to go back and forth with a suitcase full of money.
Well, it was extremely dangerous. There was one time when my middle daughter, Rachel, went to have lunch with her when she was about 10 or 11. And Granny Marion announced that one day she had been living in a forest with some people, and she had gone to collect water with a friend. And when she came back, all the other people were dead. And Rachel, who was at this point 10 or 11, had no idea what to say. And Granny Marion disappeared into the kitchen to get the oven chips. Looking back on that, I thought it was a rather extraordinary thing to say to a 10 or 11-year-old. But actually, as I mentioned before, my husband's a war reporter. And at this point, he was in Baghdad under siege. And I think she was trying to tell Rachel that Granny had been in war too, and it's all quite normal. But that's my subsequent take on it.
So let's shift to Val d'Isere, Doctor, and tell us a little bit about Dr. Petrie and who he is. And I know there's a mystery in the book, and I'm not even sure. You can tell me if you solved it. That's up to you. About why he would risk what he risked to. He's not Jewish, to risk what he risked for about a 14-year-old Jewish girl who broke her leg.
Yes, well, I go back to it. The subtitle of my book sums up the book. It's Betrayal, Love, and Resistance in Wartime France. We've covered the betrayal, we've covered the resistance. Now let's talk about love. It's a love of a mother for her daughters. It's the love of two sisters and the love of Granny Marion's efforts to try to help and protect UJA after their mother had been deported to Auschwitz. But it's also a book about the love of strangers and the love of humanity. And I think that's what makes it very relevant for the 21st century. Because when you get asked, why did Dr. Petrie save me? She changed the narrative. She took the spotlight away from the perpetrator and away from the victim, and she shone it right on to the bystander and asked the question, what would you do? What would you do to save someone? And this question is really important. I don't think it's a mystery as to why Dr. Petrie saved somebody. That's people who, and as Dr. Petrie was recognized as righteous among nations very quickly by Yad Vashem. And he was very classic of somebody who does something to deserve being recognized as righteous among nations. He was also, he was more than anything, he was a repeat offender of being righteous. Huguette was not the only person that he saved. After she had left Val d'Isere and gone with Marion to Toulouse, after her leg was mended, he climbed up into the, high up onto the Col des Erins. Now, the Col des Erins is the highest mountain pass in Europe, outside of Georgia. So we're talking real mountain pass. And he went up there on a November night to rescue a British serviceman who had been stranded in a snowdrift in literally his prison clothing. And he carried him back down off the mountain and nursed him. He did not tell people that he had saved this man either, because the British were quite unpopular because they'd been bombing French cities, and it was, Dunkirk and all this stuff. It seems one way in Britain, but it seems another way in France. But Petrie never talked about what he did. He just saved people because it was the natural thing to do. And this is why I think it's an important question for the 21st century, because it really asks you, what would you do? Where is your moral compass? And it wasn't just the mega moral compass of Dr. Petrie who helped Huguette and Marion during these years. There were small little acts of kindness. The man on the train who asked Huguette to show her ID card, and he saw that she'd been born in Berlin, and he said, "Are you Jewish?" And she said no, and he just decided to leave it. The stranger who gave her some money at the station, the neighbors who told her that she had to leave Nice immediately. And she asked me, why did these people carry out these acts of kindness? Now, this is really important, because in the writing this book, I discovered that public opinion really mattered in France during the Second World War. It was quite different from, say, Poland, where we've got total war and total mass destruction. In France, the Holocaust played out in a very different way, which allowed the French governments in Vichy to choose how they would react. and it allowed ordinary people to choose how they reacted. So, for example, after the big roundups of 1942, the Veldiv roundup, which you may well have heard of, it was extremely unpopular with people in France, and very famously, the Archbishop Saliège lectured from his pulpit about how Jews are people and you can't treat people like this. And his sermon was repeated across churches in France. And the Vichy government saw that things were going against them. They literally saw, just like a contemporary government, the Poles were against them. And they cancelled all deportations, and no deportations left France for 3 months. It's really shocking when you realize that, because it just shows that you could stand up to the Nazis and say no. And I think this is very important, because we have this image of the Nazis as all powerful people, which comes from the TV screens and the movies. But in France, it was not the case at all.
You talk about, I was thinking about the kind of that everybody wants to know, like, who the French were in the war. So you're going to have people who are actively resisting. You have a small but strong resistance. You have people who are actively collaborating. And then you probably have the mass of people who are like the rest of us, I almost want to say, maybe, who are maybe hoping this thing will pass quickly. Maybe they're fearful for their own lives and livelihoods. Maybe they don't care, or they close the shades, as the expression goes. So you paint a picture of France. That's all these people, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, we've got the two spectrums. One side, we've got the resistors and we've got the collaborators, but the people in the middle are in this massive grey zone. And these are the people who matter. These are the people who, at the beginning in 1940, are just greatly relieved that the war is not going to destroy the country. And they also worship Pétain, because Marshal Pétain, who was the leader of Vichy, had been the leader of the French forces during the First World War, and people worshipped him and believed that he would save France. But as the war went on, public opinion began to change. Even changed within Nice under in the Italian occupation zone, because the Italian occupation of Nice was actually very, very harsh. And there was near starvation, and it turned the French against the Italians as well. So we're not just talking about being turned against Vichy. So when the Germans come in to Nice, basically the French won't do anything to help them, because they're just so sick of anybody occupying them that's the end of it. So public opinion begins to change, and it's very interesting how you see this happening over this 4-year period. And also how it's corrupted by General de Gaulle when he returns to France, and he makes up this whole story about a nation of résistants, which is all a load of baloney as well.
Mm-hmm. And the kind of the levels of anti-Semitism, I think there was a lot of what we would call, everyday functional anti-Semitism, but there's also anti-German feeling, and in some cases, things were done on behalf of the Jews because the anti-German feeling outweighed the anti-Jewish feeling. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
I think that's very true. Now, that's also a very important aspect of why Dr. Petrie was willing to help and to hide Huguette. He had been brought up in Alsace-Lorraine, and Alsace-Lorraine was occupied by Germany after 1870 and was part of Germany until the end of the First World War. And the Germanization of Alsace-Lorraine was extreme. And he grew up in this atmosphere, and he was fiercely anti-German, although interestingly his nickname was Fritz, even though he was called Frederic. But many people from Alsace were involved in the resistance precisely because of this.
So at this point, I want to tell folks who are on the call on the Zoom that if you have a question for Rosie Whitehouse, you can put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as best we can. I can't promise we'll get to them all. What does Huguette remember of her experience in hiding? I guess you can call it hiding. When she had the leg, she was spent 6 months at the doctor's house. Does she have memories of that time?
Yeah, and I think they're very important, because Granny Marion always saw the war as a very dark place and something you didn't talk about. Now, it's not just not talking about it because it was a trauma. It was if you were in the resistance, you didn't talk about what you were doing. You kept quiet. You didn't tell people about what was going on. So it became a natural reaction. But while Huguette was at Dr. Petrie's house, he would come and talk to her every day and talk to her about what had happened to her. He wasn't just interested in healing legs. He was interested in people as well and trying to help to heal her with herself from within. And I think he left her with a very positive view of what had happened to her, if that's even possible to say. I think that's one of the reasons that she has always been able to talk about the Holocaust and what happened to her. Although, of course, there were very traumatic things that she doesn't remember because of the trauma. And she was a very traumatized child, because you have to remember that this is not only the story of two sisters who survived the Holocaust, it's also the story of two sisters who were refugees. When Huguette stepped down at the Gare de Lyon, she was 5 years old. She did not speak a word of French, and that their father insisted that only French was spoken at home. He sent them to a French school. He wanted them to be as French as they possibly could because he was frightened.
And hide their Jewishness as well.
Hide their Jewishness, go to church. And Huguette did not speak for 6 months. This is very common among refugee children. She refused to say a single word. And then when she was actually born Inga Margot, and when she suddenly decided, when after 6 months she was going to speak, she announced that she was no longer going to be called Inga Margot, because the kids at school made fun of her because they said her name wrong. They said, instead of Inga, they said singe, which is French for monkey. You know, how much that was just childhood playground stuff, we don't know. But she named herself after the most successful girl in school, who was called Huguette.
So tell me what happens. Take us from Val d'Isere, the end of her recuperation. She's reunited with Marion. How does the war kind of play an end for these two girls?
Well, Marion was at this point reunited with the man who was going to become her first husband, who had just been parachuted back into the Toulouse region. Things were getting really hot down there. I mean, he was blowing trains and everything he could possibly get his hands on sky high. And Das Reich, who had just come back from the Eastern Front, were moving up to try to connect with German forces in Normandy. And things were really tense. There was a real battle going on the ground in France, which resulted in retaliation by the Germans at Oradour-sur-Glane, where the village was destroyed and the people were burnt alive in the church. And that is a direct result of what was happening with the resistance activity in the region. At this point, Granny Marion returned to Val d'Isere, extremely dangerous journey across wartime France, in which she did say to me that numerous times people were trying to shop her to the Germans, and that once she was offered a lift by the Nazis in a car, and she refused, only to discover that they were raping all the women they picked up and throwing them into a ravine. So she had a lucky escape. She then returned with Huguette from Val d'Isere, and they arrived in Toulouse at the point of the liberation.
And they eventually both make their way, one to the States and one to, tell me about, before we get there.
Granny Marion by this point was pregnant. And she had to rest up in Toulouse. And immediately after the liberation, most of the major people in the resistance returned to Paris, where they sucked up the spoils from the collaborators. And she was always furious that she'd had to rest up because she was pregnant, because she missed out on a flat from a collaborator on the Champ du Mars. She got one in that, which is the big field in front of the Eiffel Tower, and she had to get one in an adjacent street, which always annoyed her. And they returned to Paris. She married Pierre, and she had 2 children, but the marriage did not last. I think much of it had to do with the fact that they had a very independent lives during the war. And then Huguette went to join her father, who went to San Francisco after the war. He also survived. And Granny Marion stayed in France until in 1960 she came here to London and married my father-in-law and started what she always called her second life. But in fact, we all know she had 3, because her first life was in Berlin.
Yeah, she was older when she left Berlin. She was into her teens when
Yeah, she was 13.
yeah. Someone asked on the chat, it's a good question, how your husband has kind of processed the family story and what it meant to him. I mean, we know he's a war correspondent. Is that an unconscious or conscious choice of someone who understands the toll of war on families and children and regions?
Well, he always said that he discovered what had happened when he was a small boy of the age of 6, when he asked why he didn't have 2 grandmothers. And Granny Marion did not know what to say. And his father took him into the other room and explained. And he said it was a moment as equivalent to watching the moon landings. It literally changed his whole worldview. But yes, I do think it's had a very important effect on him. Yeah, I remember, many times he's been in dangerous places, and particularly was in Dubrovnik during the siege. And I said to him, "Why don't you leave?" And he goes, "Well, there were no reporters in Auschwitz." And I think this is very important. And I think it's why we need to support good journalism.
And tell me about your growing up and how you really, I mean, someone who writes about the Holocaust, I know you don't have direct family experiences, but I know growing up in Britain, you certainly understood the toll of the Nazis and the effect on your family. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, well, my father was a doctor. He was an obstetrician and gynecologist. And we moved to London when I was 5 years old. And he became very friendly with 2 doctors who worked in the same hospital as him. They were both Poles and they were the best of friends. One was Jewish and one was Catholic. And they both married women who'd been in Auschwitz. And the Jewish lady had lost her family in Auschwitz, and the Catholic lady had been medically experimented on by Dr. Mengele and his team. My father operated on her a lot to try to ease the discomfort of the scar tissue. So my hand literally went where the doctors of Auschwitz hands went. And as a little girl, I found this really fascinating. The young journalist in me was amazed that there were both good doctors and bad doctors. But these 2 couples became like my uncles and my aunts. And they never stopped talking about what happened during the war. And then in the 1970s, my father went as a scientific cultural ambassador to Poland, and I went with him. And I was amazed when I got to Poland that nobody was talking about what happened in the war. And it developed in me a fascination with Eastern Europe and the history of Eastern Europe. So when I met my husband, I was already extremely interested in in the history of the Holocaust and in Eastern Europe. And we have spent much of our working lives in Eastern Europe. And I also now, as I said, work with Holocaust survivors here in the UK.
Mm-hmm. When did the girls have confirmation that that Edith was dead?
It took a long time. It took a long time. For many years afterwards, you get believed that she had died in Buchenwald, because that was of the labor camps where the Germans had taken French laborers and also taken the people from the French resistance, was the dominant theory of what had happened. So it took a long time, and eventually they were given a document that basically Edith had disappeared en route to Auschwitz. That's actually the official document that we have.
Mm-hmm. And then also this is the flip side of finding out, when many years later, Yad Vashem recognizes Dr. Petrie as a righteous among the nations. Was there a ceremony? Was there some sense of closure for Uget? Did she attend any kind of commemoration?
Unfortunately, Uget was too ill to come to Val d'Isère when the ceremony took place.
Did it? Huh.
But yes, it was a revelatory moment, because I'm quite frightened of heights, so I'm not very good in the Alps, I have to say. And also our nephew died in a skiing accident not very far from Val d'Isère. So I have rather mixed feelings about the place, that the valley giveth and taketh away.
Mm-hmm.
But when we went to Val d'Isère to the ceremony where Dr. Petrie was recognized as righteous among nations, what was really extraordinary about it was that there were all these families of other Jewish people who'd been hidden in Val d'Isère, that Huguette was not the only one. It was really a revelation about what had happened. And we met all these elderly ladies and gentlemen who were children at the time that Huguette was hidden in Val d'Isère, who remembered her and talked about her. And I really felt that it was as if Val d'Isère become a second home, which was quite extraordinary.
Very nice. Someone asked, they're interested in that. You mentioned the Joint Distribution Committee and the money that was coming in to help the Jewish resistance. How extensive was that? What did it pay for? Our viewers suggest travel, housing, food. How extensive is this network of American or of Jewish philanthropical dollars?
Well, the JDC played an enormous and a very controversial role in the Holocaust. Initially, they funded organizations within the ghettos in Poland, which is controversial. But as the war moved on, their office in Zurich was the main place where they brought the money in. And it became a hub for financing resistance movements. So the money was needed in France to pay for the care of children, to take children out illegally across the border, and also to fund resistance movements, because they were also moving children out over the Pyrenees. You had to pay for hotels, you had to pay for the guides who took you over the mountains, so it was really quite extensive, and it played a very important part, not just in the Holocaust, but also in the aftermath of the Holocaust. So the JDC money is really funding the illegal immigration from Europe to Palestine Mandate.
Great, thank you. I think you may have mentioned this when you were talking about the Righteous Among the Nation honors, but someone wants to know about your contact with Dr. Petrie's survivors, his family.
When I started to look for Dr. Petrie, I started searching on the internet, just like we all do these days, and pinged up some pictures on an ancestry website of pictures of Dr. Petrie. So I wrote to the person who had stuck them up, who turned out to be his daughter, we then subsequently met in her house, and there's like the most incredible bond, I think, between us, because they always say that if you save one life, you save whole generations to come. And as I end my book by saying that when I said goodbye to his daughter in Val d'Isère after the ceremony, we left and we were going to Rome because my first grandson, was about to be born. And that is the link to Dr. Petrie, is that without Dr. Petrie, we might not have had any of these things.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Matthew Goodman, who's written a book about two older expats living in Paris who were part of the French resistance. It's called Paris Undercover. There's a new book coming out by Suzanne Cope about Italian resistors, women again. And yours is about women in the resistance. I'm just curious, do you think, these things just happen sometimes, three doesn't make a trend, but is there something right now about the stories of women who were part of the resistance that is, part of the zeitgeist? Why do you think people are writing about it right now?
Well, I think there are lots of women in the resistance. It's just that women are always underestimated, and that's very much the story of Granny Marion. She was somebody who served oven chips and cooked us a very nice Sunday lunch, and nobody bothered to think really about what she'd been doing. My father-in-law was always going on about what he'd done in invading France in 1944, but nobody bothered to ask her. So I think that there were far more women in the resistance than you realise, and basically nobody suspects a lady pushing a pram or a pretty young woman, walking around with, up and down the street with a nice little bundle of papers in a handbag. And yes, I think these stories are coming to light now, because I think people are beginning to ask some of the questions that they didn't ask before. And this is a big thing about Holocaust. It's about all of history, but the Holocaust here, it really matters, is that we think we know everything, but we don't. There are these hidden stories all the time. And that's why you have to keep on asking questions about it, about understanding what happened, and also understanding as to why that people did not talk about Jewish resistance. And I think this is very important because most of those people who were involved in the Jewish resistance became involved in the rescue of Jews from Europe, as I mentioned before, and the illegal immigration to Palestine mandate. And basically, when one of the leading members of that movement said to Golda Meir, "Can I go on TV and talk about my experiences?" This was in the 1960s, and she said, "Over my dead body, do we ever let them know what we get up to?" So there was a general idea that you would hush everything up and you would not talk about it, which is one of the reasons that we only ever think about the Warsaw Ghetto. We don't think about the extent of Jewish resistance in Poland. I mean, across the ghettos in Poland, it's phenomenal how much resistance there was.
So, Beryl, you know what I'd love you to do? I'd love you to show another. There's a photo of, I think, the three young women, just so again we leave with an image of who they are. You write about the contemporary memory of the Holocaust in Europe. I think it's important to have these faces when we talk about. Oh, and I can let you identify them in a second. But you talk about the national rally in France, and what are your concerns about the kind of, I'm going to call it the history of memory in Europe at a time of rising nationalism?
Well, yes, it's a big issue, and history is politicized, so it's very concerning. And as to tell the truth, as to what happened, and the history of the Holocaust played an enormous role in the last presidential election, with Eric Zemmour, claiming that the French state protected the Jews when it was absolutely incorrect. And that this is a contemporary issue, and right across Europe we see the history of the past being corrupted, which is why it's important to keep the Holocaust in a contemporary place, to see how we remember it, why we remember it like this. And I'm also the author of a guidebook to the Holocaust in Europe. And that's a really fundamental part of that book, is actually saying, right, where is it remembered and why is it remembered like this? And why do people choose to remember it in such a way?
Oh, thank you for that. So who's in this photo? I think I know, but remind us who it is, left to right.
Well, the Zagetta's in the middle, and Granny Marion is the one who has clearly been sunbathing nude. And the lady on the other side is Irene, her friend who died in a car crash. And I think what's beautiful about this picture is it's not only extremely tender, but it could have been taken yesterday. It's very modern. And I think that we have a tendency, when we look at the Holocaust, to think of, to see, old ladies queuing up in Auschwitz with the, scarves and bundles. But this was something that happened in a very contemporary society. And, it could so easily have happened in Britain or in the United States. These were very modern young people.
Oh, I think that's a very poignant, we'll use that word again, note to end on. Rosie, I want to thank you for your book. I want to thank you for your time tonight. I want to thank all our viewers for tuning in, and a number of them thank you for the book, and are looking, and the ones who haven't, they're looking forward to reading it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and thank you all for attending. Have a great night, and we'll see you at the next folio.